Good morning, or afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time of day that you're watching this video. And here we go, week 4. Did you stop to think that we are just about halfway done with this class? So this is the lecture for April 1 through 7, and I'm making it available to you on Friday the 29th of March. I had to look at my calendar, which is hanging on the wall right over there. Okay, a couple things about the assignments which are due today and by midnight tonight. I'm going to make some observations, first of all, about the textbooks, and I'm not expecting you to include this material in your reviews. Instead, I just want you to have an idea on, I got some hair sticking up there. Sorry about that. I just want you to have some ideas about a couple of things in the book that you need to have your attention called to. One is this book by Lang, Small Teaching, a little different approach to what we think of as far as teaching. He has a lot of good material in it. Now, he's writing for a broad perspective of listeners, people that are involved in education, people that are involved in sciences, people that are involved in math. So he's giving clues and thoughts about ways you can teach regardless of that subject matter. Of course, we're not teaching math, we're not teaching science, we're teaching the scriptures, preaching the scriptures, teaching the scriptures. So we'll have to modify that accordingly. We also may be dealing with Sunday school and with pastors and lay people in a church, and we'll have to modify for that. However, there are some things in the book that I think are extremely interesting and beneficial. I'm going to call a couple things to your attention that you may or may not have observed. And this is perhaps because I observe these things and I think that they are significant. But on page 21, he refers to Aristotle's work titled On Memory. This is near the top of the page. And in order to get Aristotle's point, he quotes from another book by Brown, Roediger, I guess that's how you pronounce that, and McDaniel. There's a better way, and that is to actually quote Aristotle himself. I have the full works of Aristotle on my shelves. Matter of fact, I have lots of the classics, the Greek writers of the pre-Christian era. And I want to read a quote from Aristotle's actual book, translated by J.L. Beer. This is in the Loeb Classical Library series. And here is Aristotle's complete thought as he writes on this particular subject. So you can compare what Aristotle actually wrote with the brief citation. Aristotle wrote, "Mnemonic exercises aim at preserving one's memory of something by repeatedly reminding him of it, which implies nothing else on the learner's part than the frequent contemplation of something, such as the mnemonic device, whatever it may be, as a likeness and not as out of relation." So that's the full quote, and you can observe that as far as this particular page number is concerned. There is another item that I caught on page 33 of the book, and this is one about, halfway down the page. It's in a sentence. Excuse me. It's in the sentence. It begins with the word if. It's in the left-hand margin. If it's a simple enough question you have posed at the end, you can make the exercises the penultimate activity and a brief review of the answer the ultimate activity. Now, do you notice as you read that there's something missing? There's a missing word or a missing phrase. There's something missing in that sentence. If it's a simple enough question you have posed at the end, that part's simple and that's easy to understand, you can make the exercises the penultimate activity, that's okay, and a brief review of the answer the ultimate activity. There's something missing there, and I'm not sure what he had in mind. A brief review of the answer of the ultimate activity, describing the ultimate activity, related to the ultimate activity. I don't know what he intended, but there's a word that's missing in that particular sentence, maybe a couple of words. Another comment I want to make is on page 169. I think I referred to this earlier in one of the class lectures, and I'm going to refer to it again briefly here. Down, again, about halfway down the page, he has a sentence that begins, according to this theory, and then he goes on, the best and deepest learning takes place when it is driven by intrinsic motivators. When, in other words, and put simply, the learner cares about the learning itself, or the matter to be learned, rather than about some reward she will receive at the end of the learning period. What he's saying there very simply is, if you motivate people so that they want to study and have an interest in something, they will seek to find the answer. And indeed, I think I commented before that many of my personal studies, my journal articles and things of that nature, came out of that very thing. I had an intrinsic motivation. I cared about the learning itself because I wanted to find an answer. If we can motivate students along that line, we can certainly help them greatly in their learning process. As I said, I'm not expecting you to put that material in your personal review. That's just extra that I wanted to give to you from my perspective on the situation. Now, I also want to make some comments about this book, Heart Deep Teaching. I already gave you information about the author, that I had talked with him on the phone. I like the book. I like the overall emphasis of the book. But there are some areas in the book that I noticed as I was reading it that needed some correction. There are some errors that I think are in the book, and some things that would have helped the book to read a little bit more concisely and better. On page 26, which is the left-hand page, a little bit past halfway down the page, he has a paragraph that begins, by aligning these 6 dimensions of life with God's purposes, a person will grow and become Christ-like in character and action. So far, so good. Only as the heart is committed to love and submission, Christ will life transformation begin. And he says, and submit to Christ will life transformation happen. The word submit should be submits. Only as the heart is committed to love and submits to Christ. The heart is singular. Submit goes with a plural verb. They submit. He submits. So the word submit should be submits. That's a correction that ought to be made in your book. I catch things like this. On page 45, he refers indirectly to people, and I want to be more specific. He's talking about the cognitive domain. And the second sentence in that, he says, even in the field of religious education, pastors and Sunday school teachers tended to focus on biblical knowledge and understanding more than character change or spiritual development. In my book on persuasive preaching, I've specifically referred to this kind of thing. And one leading proponent of this idea that the purpose of our ministry should be the communication of knowledge is a man by the name of Dwayne Litfin, and I refer to him in my book on persuasive preaching. So that is the kind of person he's referring to here. I also want you to notice page 45, the diagram, the heart deep teaching and learning, the ladders that go through those circles. Keep that in view because I'm going to come back to it in just a bit. All right, on page 54, top of the page, he says, by integrating the 4 taxonomies related to cognitive, affective, volitional, and behavioral domains, we can see their usefulness in helping us to move deeper toward heart-deep teaching through all levels within all domains. Now notice, it may be helpful to picture the different domains as ladders descending to the depths of the heart of the person. That's what you have on page 45. There it is, page 45, the diagram that's there with the ladders. That's what he's referring to on page 54, but he's not clear on that. I think it would have been helpful for him to put in parentheses here, see page 45. That would have helped you and helped all readers. So that's something you can keep in mind there. Another thing that I think would have also helped him in the development of the book is on page 69. 69. Notice down at the bottom third of the page, bottom fourth of the page, there's the heading, Identifying the Exegetical Big Idea of the Text. Now, if you're familiar with Haddon Robinson and his textbooks, his approach to preaching and so forth, you've heard the phrase big idea. But it's interesting, he doesn't define it here. Indeed, you have to get way over to page 78. So turn to page 78. And on page 78, up at the top, very first line, the big idea is defined as the main overarching principle of any given text. I find it intriguing. He introduces the big idea on page 69, finally gets around to defining it on page 78. I think if he had put in a definition right here on page 69, it would have made it more clear. You might want to cross-reference that in your text as I have done in mine. He refers to the ADDIE model numerous times, and I think that that's something we're going to look at today. On page 147, notice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines down. He said, I appreciate David Kolb's study of the dynamics of the cycle of experiential learning and so forth. Do you remember David Kolb? We had quite a few pages about him. So there you've got a connection between Kolb and this particular textbook. All right, the next thing, on page 169, the last paragraph on the page. This diagram depicts the center of the person as his heart, his innermost part of the lesson, 3 ladders. What diagram? The diagram back on page 45. So you might want to make a note here to look back at page 45. That's the connection. There's one other one that I want to refer to, which I think was a typing error. Bottom of page 100, what is it? 86. Bottom page 186. The third example of a learning experience, the step in the lesson, focusing on application and depth, is taken from a lesson on Ephesians 4, 1 through 14. And then on the very next page, he gives you the lesson outline. Notice he says there, text, Ephesians 5, 1 through 16. I have a suspicion that at one point in the writing of the book, at the bottom of the one page, Ephesians 4, 1 through 14 was the text that he was planning to use. Somewhere in the process of writing, he shifted gears and decided to use Ephesians 5, 1 through 16, and missed the correlation. So there's a few things that I noticed in that particular book. Those are minor details. And like I said before, I appreciate the book, appreciate its emphasis. All right. Next week, you've got a couple of things that are going to be necessary. This week, April the 1st, you're supposed to turn in your first sermon, manuscript, outline, so forth, or your lesson plan if you're going to be doing a teaching. Next week, April the 8th, you turn in your second one. So remember that. That's a major assignment in this course, both of these, and they're both due. The first one's due today. The second one is due next week. Those are major parts of this course. If you remember that, those are going to be critical for you to keep in mind. You also have one book to review for next Monday night, the 8th of April, and that is ESTEP and Allison. So you'll keep that in mind. All right, ESTEP, Anthony, and Allison. All right, let's shift gears now, and we're going to turn to our lecture material for today. And we're going to start on page 113 with the Beloit College Mindset List. Beloit College is up in Beloit, the city of Beloit, Wisconsin. And they have released this Beloit Mindset List every August since 1998. So it's been coming out on a regular basis. The point is to help professors, college student professors, to understand what their students are like as they come in each year and where they come in with their thinking. Now, if you're an older person, and all of us in this class are older than college age, I'm probably the oldest in the class, and this coming August the 17th, I'll be 78 years old. So I've gone through a lot of these mindset shifts. You're going through them as well. Even if you're 40 or 50, you're going through this same process. You grew up in an age which was totally different than the kids who are growing up today. And likewise, if you grew up in a foreign country, foreign from the United States perspective, like Alfred has done, you likewise had a different mindset. If you grow up in an Asian country, you'll have a different mindset yet. If you grow up in a South American country, you'll have a mindset that's different yet. But what they're doing is looking at it specifically by age. The first couple of pages, I gave you information about the authors of this and even gave you their pictures on page 114 so you can see what they look like. So let's jump to page 115. Students entering into their first year of college this year, 2017, this was the year that I used. I could have picked 2018, but they're all about the same at this point. Notice, he says students entering their first year of college this year, 2017, are mostly 18 years old. That means they were born in 1999. All right? So if you're a student, if you've got people in your church that were born in 1999, thereabouts, this is what's on their heads. This is what's in their heads. For example, right at the top, he says, among the iconic figures who have never been alive in their lifetime are Joe DiMaggio, some of you may not know, the famous baseball player, John F. Kennedy Jr., one of our presidents of the United States, Walter Payton, famous football player, and Dusty Springfield. Then he goes on to talk about their classmates. Their classmates could include Eddie Murphy Zola and Mel Gibson's Tommy, or Jackie Evancho singing down the hall. Now, some of us may not even know who all of these people are as we go through all this list, but your students who are 18 years old, they know. He says they are the last class to be born in the 1900s, the last of the millennials. Enter next generation on cue, Generation Z. So we've moved into that. And you run down through the list, and you can see what you've got. In their, look at number 19. In their lifetimes, BlackBerry has gone from being a wild fruit to being a communication device to becoming a wild fruit again. Remember when there was a BlackBerry that you carried in your hand, an electronic device? They're basically gone today. Just jump down a little bit farther. I'll pick one out at random. Number 38. They have only seen a checker cab in a museum. I grew up in the days of checker cabs. Those are gone. Notice number 40. They never got to see Jimmy Kimmel and Ben Stein co-host a quiz show, or Dennis Miller provide commentary for the NFL. Did you even know that Jimmy Kimmel, who's on late night TV, was a commentator on the, was ever a comedian, a quiz show host? And did you know that Dennis Miller was ever a commentary for the NFL? Let's see, what else do we want to say? Number 47. The BBC has always had a network in the United States where they speak American rather than British English. Notice the number 54. Family Guy, the TV show, is the successor to The Father Knows Best. That's another TV show they never knew. Father Knows Best went off TV years ago. Family Guy has been around for several years. All right, and Bill Clinton, number 59, has always been Hillary Clinton's aging husband. They don't remember that Bill Clinton used to be the president of the United States because they weren't born then, but Bill Clinton was. All right, and notice number 60 at the bottom of the very last one. Paleontologists have always imagined dinosaurs with colorful plumage. That may be what they do currently, but many, many years ago, dinosaur books never had them with colorful plumage. So things change, mindsets change. This is just a brief introduction to the fact that people that we minister to have different mindsets. People that you minister to in your church have different mindsets. If you've got a 15-year-old and a 25-year-old and a 45-year-old compared to a 75-year-old, you have lots of different mindsets. And we have to try to communicate the best we can to all of them. That's our responsibility as those who minister the Word of God and proclaim the message of the Lord Jesus. Okay, let's move on to page 117. Coming to grips with the learning process. And I've adapted this from a book by Isler and Habermas, and I said that right at the beginning. If you want to, you can read that book and get a lot more detail. But this is where I adapted this. Now, I've included other material that they did not. For example, the cartoons, that didn't come from them. I've added those. But there are some things that I've borrowed from them. Let's concern the core of education as we begin. Leamson writes, this core is what it always has been, a personal interaction between teacher and student, no matter the technology. So right now we're using a video, we're using the situation that we have with Blackboard, where you're sitting in your office or home or wherever you are, in whatever state you happen to be, and I'm here in my home, in my office, and we're communicating with one another indirectly via video and via written communication, regardless of the technology. What Leamson's saying, teaching at its core continues to be a relationship between a teacher and a student. So in this particular course, I take the role of teacher, you take the role of student, but in your ministry, you take the role of teacher or pastor, and you have students and parishioners. That interpersonal interaction continues. Wilhoit and Ryken add this, simply having ready access to a variety of computer resources doesn't guarantee effective results. That's true. You can have a computer, you can take a class, that doesn't necessarily guarantee we're going to have effectiveness as far as the results. Now let's consider some humor about computers. We're talking about computers, a variety of computer resources, and I copied these. I say this may at times feel more like fact than fiction. For example, have you ever been in the situation where you've got an IT person looking over your shoulder and the IT person says something like double click, control, shift? It's totally intuitive. And you're sitting there like that young lady with a rather befuddled look. Every time my IT man comes to my house to fix something on my computer, and I just had that done not too long ago, and he tells me, now do this, do this, do this. I always say, no, wait a second, I have to write that down. I'm going to show you something. In order to get this video from me speaking it to you into Blackboard, I follow a rather detailed list. I'm not going to let you read it, but that's the list that I have to follow. I have to go through all those steps in order to get it from here to you, in order to make sure that it makes it clearly and directly. To an IT person, that's intuitive. To me, that requires a list. It's not totally intuitive. On the next page, I gave you a couple other ones. Can you imagine the little kid? No, Grandma, listen. Double click the Internet Explorer icon. Do you ever feel like the kids know a whole lot more about the electronic devices than you do? Let me give you just one quick example. Many years ago, I had a cell phone and it was able to text. I had no clue how to text. So I asked my granddaughter to teach me how to text, and she graciously did. I'm a little bit more in tune with how to use my smartphone today, but I still tell people my smartphone is a lot smarter than I am. It does a whole lot more than I do. I remember the days when you used telephones to talk to people. not check the internet and your email and your text messages and all that kind of stuff. Notice the next one. The woman sitting there, and she said, all I did was hit the delete button and her computer just vanished. You ever feel like yours is going to do about that same thing? Or do you feel more like the man on the next page 119, where she says, there are better ways to log off? Do you ever feel frustrated with your technology? Or how about the last one? You've been on the online for 1 year. Do you wish to log off and get a life? Yes, no, or remind me next year. Do you ever feel something like that? Now that brings me to a more serious one. This is on page 120. This is a podium which actually does exist. I have been in a couple of seminaries, one in New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, and one out in Portland, Oregon, where they had podiums just like this. And you can see what's involved. For example, right up at the very top, it has a microphone. You see that? And then it goes around, there's a light that helps you see your notes that are on the podium. Then you have an intercom to speak to the AV tech support, and they had one of those. So if you had a glitch in your classroom, you just connected the intercom and spoke to him. You had USB and audiovisual plugins. You had a laptop and network connections, so you could connect that. You come down a little bit farther, you got power outlets in case you want to plug something else in. You have pull-out shelves, so you can put books on them. You have a cabinet with wireless microphone in it, so if you're in a large classroom, you can put on a mic and people in the class can hear. This one that I'm looking at had a DVD and VCR. More modern ones probably have dropped out the VCR and now have a DVD and Blu-ray. You also have some that have a slide-away keyboard with a touchpad, so you can function that way. You have something which tilts for your lecture notes. You have a touch screen. All of that involved in the podium itself. By the way, the school I was at in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, indicated that each of these podiums was an investment, if I remember correctly, of about $4,000. And that was back about the year 2000. And I'm sure they have advanced since then. But this is all part of the technological revolution. We are moving more and more that direction. Now, capital B on page 120. Concerning critical definitions, some authors have suggested this. Teaching. It's any activity that has the conscious intention of and potential for facilitated learning in someone else. So, am I teaching? Teaching is any activity that has the conscious intention to facilitate learning. That is my conscious intention. So as far as Leamson concerns, I am teaching. However, Wilkinson balances that. The students are responsible to learn the material, but the teacher is responsible to cause them to know the material. And I think that that's important. We want students to learn. We have a desire for students to learn. We try to motivate students to learn. My desire is to cause you to learn, but you still have to learn. Well, so what is learning? It's stabilizing through repeated use certain appropriate and desirable synapses in the brain. And Leamson, if you read him, has a lot to say about what's going on up here in our brain. The law of the student states the student is responsible to learn, regardless of the quality of the teacher. Let me give you, you've all had good teachers and bad teachers over the years, I'm sure. Some of my best teachers, I remember very, very fondly. The absolute worst teacher that I ever had was a teacher in college, and he was a history of civilization teacher. His idea of teaching was, let me give you an example. I've got a journal sitting here on my desk, JETS, the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. And when we came into a class, here is the way that this particular teacher taught. He took the textbook, and we had a big textbook. He took the textbook, opened it up, laid it on his desk after he took the roll and prayed, and started to read. And for the rest of the class, 50 minutes long, he read the pages from the textbook to us students sitting there in the class. And if he would have read it with vitality and interest and excitement, that would have been one thing. But he read it more like this. Hippolytus tells us those in Abraham's bosom get to enjoy the face of the fathers and the righteous. The understanding here is that the righteous ones are taken to where their righteous ancestors are, while the wicked go elsewhere. The rich man can never cross over to the father Abraham, and Abraham can never cross over to him. God has cut off the rich man from his fathers by placing a chasm between them. In Genesis 17:14, God says to Abraham, "Any uncircumcised male who is not uncircumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." And that's what we got for the next 50 minutes. That was not the greatest teacher in the world, but guess what? Students in the class still had to take the class, still had to take the test, still had to do the assignments, and still got a grade. Regardless of the quality of the teacher, we as students were required to learn. All right, he goes on, I quoted from Morrison, I quoted from Clark. Let's drop down education on page 121. Education is learning that has been facilitated by teaching. So when we think in terms of Christian education, we're thinking in terms of learning, which has been facilitated by, it has been driven by, it has been helped to by teaching. Pedagogy, we're going to come back to that in a little bit. I'll skip it for now. Capital C under that, I quote Leamson one more time that I want to quote here. Concerning technology, Leamson has helpful observations. He issues a significant challenge. Now, this is what he says. Notice the quotation. Name 3 multimedia programs that actually inspired you. Now, name 3 teachers that made a difference in your life. And my guess is most of us get more excited about our teachers than we do our technology. Now, I have technology. Bible study programs, they can be extremely valuable, but I still like teachers. I like to be instructed. I like to sit and hear a good sermon. I like to sit and hear a good lecture, hear a good Sunday school class. We still like teachers. All right, that brings me to bottom of page 121, the goals of the learning process. Remember, Ambrose writes, not all students or professors or pastors can do all things, and the student's goal for themselves may differ from our goals for them. I have goals that I would love to see happen in your lives. You may have different goals. If you achieve your goals, and if I achieve my goals, and if they correlate, that's great. If you achieve my goals, that's okay. But if you achieve your goals, that's even better. Stimulate thinking. How do you know if students are thinking? Well, it's a little tough when you're on the internet like this. If you're in a classroom, you can call on them to recite. You can have them retell data. You can have them write a summary. That's one of the things I'm doing. I'm having you write. You can ask questions. I'm doing that through the discussion board questions. You can give them an examination. I'm not going to do that in this class. I've got plenty of other work for you to do. We're not going to have any exams in this class. Arouse a spirit of inquiry. Bain suggests at the core of most professors' ideas about teaching is an incorrect focus on what the teacher does rather than what students are supposed to learn. Rather than focus on me, I'm trying to focus on the material so that it will reach you. Now, I try to be as photogenic as possible at my age and the way I look. I try to smile occasionally, like I'm doing right now. I try to look in the camera as much as I can. Can you see me looking at you? I do at times have to look down. I have to see where I am on my notes. But as much as possible, I want to connect with you. I want to try and arouse in you a spirit of inquiry. Motivate to work. Roman numeral 2 on page 122, the levels of learning. what they are. Excuse me. Memorization. That's the first and the lowest step. That's, in some cases, that's all teachers require. This is a personal thought with me. There are some children's programs, and I'm going to just, without naming particular names, there are some children's programs that focus on memorization of Scripture. And I think that's good. We need to memorize Scripture. But the problem is they focus so much on the mere memorization that kids come in on a midweek service for a particular youth meeting. They haven't learned their memory verse, and they sit down real quick and they try to learn it. They say, I got to stick this in my head so I can say it and get points for it. And they do, and they get points for it. And then they leave, and before they get home that night, they have no clue what they've just done. Memorization can be great, but it also can have serious weaknesses. And if you're going to continue the memorization, you have to continually repeat it. There was a time in my career when I performed dramatic monologues, and you may have picked that up from my book on biographical preaching. I had full costumes, beard, everything. I have written out scripts that I committed to memory for various biblical characters. For example, I had a monologue on the Old Testament man Lot, on the Old Testament man Job, on the Old Testament man Jonah, on the Old Testament man Boaz. I had New Testament monologues on King Herod and Pontius Pilate. I had one on Simon the Zealot, John Mark. I went on and on. I had a number of these that I committed to memory. But you know what I found? I don't have a photographic memory. And so I had to keep reviewing those to keep them in my head. The last one I did was just about a year ago. I was in the country of New Zealand. My wife and I were visiting there. By the way, it is a beautiful island country. We loved our time there. But I did a monologue while I was there. And when I finished it, told my wife, had a good response from the listening audience. People thought that it went very well, but I knew the struggle that I had in it. And when we finished, I told my wife, that's my last one. At my age, it is simply too hard to keep all that data clear in my head. And so I sent all of my costumes, my scripts, everything, sent them to my son, who's way younger than I am. And he has already done one this last Christmas. Took one of my monologues, a shepherd's story of the birth of Christ, and incorporated two of his daughters, who are twins, 11 years old, incorporated them into the script so that there were three of them that did the script rather than just a monologue. And we watched it on the computer and just loved it. It was great. But it gets harder, and you have to have continuing review. But just memorizing isn't sufficient. You need to go beyond that to understanding. That's where you recognize things. And then you'd have to go beyond that to expressing it, where you can restate it to someone else. And then you have to seek the relational level, where you can understand how it supports your beliefs by evidence and reason, and then applying it. You don't until it finds expression in your own personal life. All of that is necessary for a successful teaching process. And you can read the details in the notes there in front of you. What the levels of learning involve. On bottom of page 123. Now notice I have a parentheses note that I think is crucial for you to see. These items are arranged in a logical flow. Chronologically, they fluctuate. So you have to look at them in some sequence in order to be able to comprehend them. So I've given them to you in a logical sequence, but you have to realize that they can fluctuate in the process. There are 8 of them. Attention. You have to get people's attention. Desire, where you have them want to understand it. Observation, notice how they can inspect it. Comprehension, grasp it with the intellect. Apperception, the process of understanding something in comparison to what you have previously learned. Remember that your perception becomes your reality. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. Reflection, the thought, idea, opinion formed as a result. Correlation, how does it relate to other areas of knowledge? And finally, application. All of those are important and they interconnect with one another, so they don't always flow in a perfect sequence. The 9 events of instruction, I've adapted these from Hoddle's book, and you can see what I've done here. Capital A, gain attention. B, stating objectives. C, recall of prerequisite information. D, presentation of new material. Notice, we often plan specifically what we will teach. We also need to give attention to how we will teach it. All right? I made a comment, speakers, including preachers and teachers, often give great amounts of time to the content, but minimal time to the way they will present that content. I would encourage you, until you get a lot of experience, that you practice well your material. If you're going to preach, go over to your auditorium before you preach and preach it to the empty congregation, to the empty building. Just preach it. Get a feel for it. Know how long it's going to take. Know what's going on. Practice it, practice it, practice it. I still practice my sermons, and I've been at this a long time. Notice how you need guided learning, eliciting performance, feedback. I try to give you feedback. Hopefully, you're understanding it as we do. Assessment, and then retention and transfer. Basically, what I want you to do is get the material, retain it yourself, but more than that, transfer that material to others. And that brings me to page 126, the ADDIE model. You've already read Hoddle's book, ISD from the Ground Up. So you already know that the ADDIE model, ADDIE, those each stand for a particular item. A, analysis. The first D, design. The second D, development. The I, implementation. And finally, evaluation. There are various versions of the ADDIE model, and we're going to take a look at some of them. But first, a summary. Page 126, analysis. During this stage, the designer, and he's talking about designing a course, designing a Sunday school curriculum, designing a Master of Divinity curriculum, designing a PhD curriculum. We're designing something. We have to identify the learning problem, the goals, objectives, the needs of the audience, what the existing knowledge is, and any other relevant characteristics. Analysis also considers the learning environment, any constraints on that environment, the delivery options, and the timeline. For example, the timeline in this course, clear, 7 weeks. It begins on a particular day, it ends on another particular day. We're locked into that. If we were in a one-week module, we'd be locked into that. If we were in a 15-week semester, we'd be locked into that. If we're in a Sunday school class, we may not be quite so locked into it. We may extend over many, many weeks. We may say we're going to go 13 weeks on this subject and end up going 18. We may start a sermon series if we're a pastor and think in our minds, this series is going to go 8 sermons, and then it ends up going 12, or it only ends up going 6. But that all relates to analysis. Then there's design, the process of specifying learning objectives. Then there's development, where you actually create it. When I was pastor, and I was pastor for 18 years, when I was pastor, I planned my sermons, my whole message format was lined out a year in advance. I tried to always keep it a year ahead. Sometimes I dropped down to 9 months, but then I'd extend it back up again. So I'm always thinking ahead, planning ahead, developing ahead. Now I'm an adult Sunday school teacher in our church, and I plan ahead here as well. So this is something you need to do. That's the development. You actually create it, produce it, and plan for it. Implementation. Now you have to implement your plan. You've got to put it into action. And then finally, evaluate. Now, again, this is the ADDIE model sometimes can be looked at simply as top down. Start with the A, D, D, I, E, and end up being done. But a better way to look at it, and by the way, I've given you that on page 128. Start at the top and work your way down. Analysis, to design, to development, to implementation, to evaluation. Another model is on the bottom of page 128 where you've got them lined out like that. And you can see that, where you see the interaction, where they're all interacting with one another. That is, as I analyze things, I'm thinking in terms of how I'm going to implement it. When I get down to implementation, it may force me to go back and change my analysis. So you have to always be flexible in that regard. Another way of looking at it is in this particular chart. I'm not going to read that to you. You can do that yourself. This chart shows you how the ADDIE model itself has progressed over the years from 1975 up into the 2000s. The next chart I gave you from 1975 gives you the ways that they were looking at it, how that changed into 1981. And I'm not showing you all of this material so that it's designed to confuse you. What I'm doing is showing you that even the ADDIE model itself has gone through design and implementation and evaluation and reanalysis, and it has continued to develop. That's what a good design does. Here it is, another one, how it has changed, 1995. Here's one from 1997. Here's another one that talks about how you apply it. The idea is we go through this, and we should be doing this. We should be doing this in our Sunday school classes. We should be doing this in our sermon preparation as we're thinking, where do I want to lead my congregation? How am I going to get it to how am I going to get to communicate the word of God to bring them along? How am I going to disciple these people and help them to grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord Jesus? And the point of this that we need to constantly be analyzing. We need to be designing. We need to be developing. We need to be implementing because we have to preach every week. We have to teach a Sunday school class every Sunday. But we also have to constantly be evaluating. It always has to be going on. And that's the purpose behind the ADDIE model, is to make us aware of these details and make us do it. We should be doing it in an individual class. I do it in this class. I have made significant changes between the first time I taught this class and this time I've taught this class. You get to only see where I am today, but I will make changes before I teach this class again. I will add some things to my notes. I may take some things out of my notes. I've already made a change in one particular item as a result of a suggestion that I have received in this class itself. Next time I teach it, I'll be making some differences. So we're constantly in this evaluation process because none of us have reached perfection. I've been at this, as I've said, a long time. I've been teaching this course a long time. I think this is the 10th time that I've taught this course for Piedmont International University. It has never been the same. The first time was different than the second. The second was different than the third. The third was different than the fifth. This one is different than the ones that have preceded. My notes change. I change. My students change. It's constantly being evaluated, constantly being reanalyzed. My syllabus has changed. I used to teach this as a 1-week module. This is the first time I've taught it in a 7-week session. There were massive changes that took place. All of that required analysis and design and redevelopment and new implementation. And now I'm in the process of evaluation. And I've already made notes in my syllabus and in my classroom notes on how I'm going to vary it again when I teach it again. And by the way, I am scheduled to teach it again in the fall of this year. I don't know if I'll get any students or not. We'll see how that develops. But that's the whole purpose of the ADDIE model, to bring us to that realization and help us to think through those things. You need to think through them in your ministries, your teaching ministries, your preaching ministries, whatever it happens to be, so that you know where you're going and the very best of your ability under God's grace and by His power of His Spirit, you're going to be helping your people to grow and become more and more like the Lord Jesus. Okay, that was a little bit of a sermon, I guess you'd call it. Let's go to page 136. Applying the lesson. Once we have the idea of getting material across, we need to apply it. Now, I'm going to do some things here that I'm going to make some comments about along the way. The introductory material, you can read it. Roman number 1, applying the lesson through self-activity. Utilize a student's interest and needs. Do this particularly in the introduction to each lesson, but continue it throughout the lesson. See the discussion in Wilkinson, and then I also gave you a chart there, which is a little bit hard to read in your page, but I hope you can sort it through. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow was a Jewish psychologist. So he's not a Christian, and he's not looking at it from a thoroughly biblical perspective, that's for sure. And there are weaknesses in his model, but there is a common sense logic to his model as well. For example, if you look at the bottom, there are 5 steps in his hierarchy of needs that he wrote about in his book. And the first one is biological and physiological needs. For example, basic life. If you don't have enough air, if you don't have enough food, then you're not going to be overly concerned about whether or not you have good self-esteem. Let me just quickly illustrate. Many years ago, I was a pastor of a church here in Warsaw, Indiana, and we had a board meeting, a board dinner. We had all of our wives. There were 3 pastors. I was the senior pastor. I had an associate pastor and a youth pastor. We were all there, and our wives. We had 12 men on the board. They were all there with their wives. So we had a substantial number of people, 24 plus 6. We had 30. And we were there for dinner. We're going to have a nice fellowship time and a brief business type thing. While we were eating dinner, I took a bite of something, and I think it was a piece of meat, and I swallowed it, and it stuck right there. Now, I don't know if you've ever had some food stick in your throat, but when it stuck, I could not breathe. By the way, remember Dr. Heimlich and the Heimlich maneuver? All right. At that point, I was gagged. I couldn't even gag. I couldn't make any noise whatever because it cut off my wind, my throat. I could not breathe in or out. I could not make any vocal sound at all. So what do you do in a case like that? Well, here's what I would have wanted to do. I would have wanted to reach into my pocket and pull out a piece of paper and then take a pen and write down on a pen by the way, we had a nurse that was there in the room with us, and we had a medical doctor that was there. The nurse was the wife of one of our board members, and the medical doctor was the board member. And I would have liked to have written on the piece of paper, I have some food stuck in my throat. I'm going to step outside, and I would like for you to come and give me the Heimlich maneuver to help me through this immediate need. That's what I would have liked to have done. What do you think I actually did? Well, I'll tell you what I actually did. You can probably already guess. I jumped up out of my seat. That got everybody's attention. And I pointed to my throat. And just stood there, pointing to my throat. The nurse immediately recognized the situation, so the doctor, but the nurse was real close. She jumped out of her chair. She ran behind me real quickly, wrapped her arms around me, and put her fist right there in my solar plexus and went boom! And that piece of meat came flying out of my mouth. At which point I could breathe. And at that time I was embarrassed. All right? Okay. At that point, when that was stuck in my throat and I could not breathe, if you would have come up to me and said, do you feel loved? Do you feel the affection of our board for you? I didn't think about affection. I didn't think about love. The only thing I thought about was I can't breathe. There's a logical flow to what Maslow does. If that is threatened, we're not interested in the next stages up. If that one is met, then we go up to safety. If that one's met, then we logically go up to belonging and love. If that one's met, then we go up logically to esteem. And if that one's met, then we logically go up to self-actualization, personal growth, and fulfillment. Now, from a biblical standpoint, we have to modify this, I know. As a matter of fact, Maslow himself modified that. And I gave you another chart on page 137. And it looks like that. Maslow's actual writing only listed, his actual chart only listed those 5. But in his book, as he wrote the book, he dealt with 3 other things that commonly get overlooked. And those 8 I put in another hierarchy. Biological and physiological, still at the bottom. Safety, still in there. Belonging, still there. Esteem, still there. Then sticks in cognitive needs. That is the need for knowledge. He talked about that, even though it wasn't in his chart. Aesthetic needs, that is for beauty and balance and form. He talked about that as well. And then self-actualization, the personal growth. And then there's another one that he put in, transcendence, where you lead others to self-actualize. So this is an adapted 8-level hierarchy. And actually, this one fits a little bit more with the grand totality of biblical teaching. But the point is that people are in different stages in their life. And we have people in our classrooms. We live in a community where you, and probably all of you do as well, where you have fairly well-to-do people, and as far as basic needs and safety needs and so forth, those are not a problem at all. But we've got some people, kids, that go to elementary school, and they get up in the morning and they have nothing to eat. And they go to school, and if they're going to get a meal during the day, they're going to have to get it at school. Because when they get home at night, they're still not going to have much to eat. They live in mobile home parks that are run down. They may live in single-parent homes. They may live in homes where the parents have never been married. The dad is long gone. Those kids are in a real predicament. Now, do they need Christ? Absolutely. And we have a ministry in our church to try to reach some of these kids and reach their families. But the reality is that when their basic biological need or their safety need is threatened, it's tough to get them up into the cognitive need and tough to get them up into the transcendence need, where they need to come to grips with Jesus Christ and Him. We're dealing with people, and people have needs, and that affects the way that we teach and the way that people learn. Page 137, methods of applying the lesson through self-activity. And I've given you some of these. And remember, we talked about some of this before. Different learning styles respond differently. I mentioned several there at the bottom of page 137 and 138. Discussion, buzz sessions, life situations. We talked about some of these before. Roman numeral 3, ways to gain interest through self-activity. Keep students interested by surprise, novelty, participation, enthusiasm. Boredom is deadly. I gave a scripture-centered content thing on the way we do ministry, and I put it there on your page so you can see it. Teaching for maximum impact. Get the students involved in what I'm teaching. I'm at 59 minutes, and we've still got several pages to go, so we're going to go quickly. We teach people according to various age needs, and some have suggested 11 stages of life, starting with prenatal, all the way up to very old age. Notice very old age, and this first one is 75 until death. I'm in the very old age. Some expand the adult category. You notice that the adults begin on number 8, early adulthood, and then up to very old. Some have expanded that, early adult transition, all the way up to late adulthood, 80 plus. In that one, I'm not quite to the last one yet. And then I indicated you can see my writing, which I put in the back of your notes, on the Greek concept of the 7 stages of life and its New Testament significance. And even the ancient Greeks, and I believe the New Testament as well, identified that we go through stages of life. Those stages of life create a difference in the way we see things. So then we go on page 140 and observe how we divide adults into different categories. We divide children into different categories, and we have a different perspective on the way that we teach them. I gave you a little bit of humor there on the AAADD, and sometimes I'm certainly feeling more and more like that. All right, we're going to move on. The rest of that you can read. I don't need to give you all the details on it. I gave you a chart on page 144. It looks like that. You may want to blow that up so you can read a little bit better. But this shows how things like evaluation, class management, assessment, all connect with planning methods and using a group, for example. I got that on a website. I don't think I gave you the, I did not give you the website. If you want to write it down, here's the website where I got that. www.learningandteaching.info/teaching/teaching _contents _05 4.gif. And you can play back the video if you want to get that in repeated. Okay, the next is identifying methods of teaching, and we talked about some of these before. I want to jump to page 145 because I'm past an hour now. Illustrations, story illustration. I gave you a thing here from Chuck Lawless. He offered 7 positive values of sermon illustrations. I like illustrations. Probably you do too. I've tried to give some in this lecture, you've noticed. Illustrations allow us to see Bible stories. Number 1, they give us opportunity to teach the word by using word-based illustrations. 2, they often engage the emotions. Stories appeal to our emotions. They help people, 3, remember biblical truth. It's easier to remember a good story sometimes than it is the verse that it's based on. They require us to pay attention to life around us. Stories draw listeners, number 5, back in. And number 6, they pepper the sermon, not become the whole sermon. All right, I went on to talk about selecting some methods of teaching, capital B, on page 146 and 147, all the way down through 6 suggestions there. And I concluded on page 148 with this chart on interactive teaching, connecting you with your listener. We can do it through lectures, that's on the left-hand column. We can do it through seminars and tutorials, which is actually closer to what we're doing in this particular class, a seminar and tutorial type thing. By the way, if you're interested, I can give you the website where you can find this one as well, which I did not give you on that sheet, www.ssdd.uce.ac.uk, United Kingdom, UK/Crumpton, CRUMPTON, /interactive teaching /key, KEY, concept map /interactive teaching map.gif. Okay, that wraps up our lecture for today. That's my first step. Now I have to get that piece of paper that I showed you earlier and go through all the necessary steps to convert this to a format that I can download to Blackboard so that you can read it, as you can watch it as well. All right, I'll try to get this up. It is 11:45 a.m. on Friday morning. So by the time I get it downloaded, or I guess I have to get it uploaded to YouTube, and then I have to get it downloaded to Blackboard, that'll still be another couple hours before I get it down there. So somewhere around 2 o'clock or so, you'll have this. If I remember, I'll send you an email to tell you that it's on, and you'll be able to see it at that time. Okay, I'll be looking forward to getting your assignments on Monday night. You've got some big ones, so be ready. And I'll be grading them as quickly as I can and returning them to you so that you can have them at your disposal, because you're going to have to teach them a week from Sunday, or whenever it happens to be that you do that particular lesson. All right, Lord bless you. Look forward to seeing you next week as well.